Let's talk today about extension tubes. I love extension tubes, but a lot of people look at extension tubes either as something to increase the reach of their existing macro lens or something that you can use for macro if you can't afford a real macro lens. Because let's face it, a macro lens, say I'm using the Nikon Z system. So a macro lens for the Nikon Z system, like the 105mm macro, the Z version, is a little expensive, whereas you can get a pair of extension tubes for $80 to $100, sometimes even less. And you can attach that to one of your existing lenses like a cheap 50mm prime. So extension tubes in that sense are seen as a cheaper way to do macro photography, but I don't think that's the case at all. I really think extension tubes also offer something that traditional macro lenses do not. They offer a way to gain different perspectives into macro with different lens characteristics that you often can't obtain with an actual macro lens. And the biggest one for me is actually shallow depth of field. I love shallow depth of field macro. That's where shallow depth of field is purposefully used to create a more dreamy image. Now, traditional macro lenses often have a maximum aperture of f2.8, and f2.8 is pretty fast, especially if you're on a full frame camera. Nevertheless, it's not as fast as some of the lenses you can get that have wider apertures. For example, if you're into 50mm lenses, you can often get them at f1.2 or f1.4 apertures, or maybe even faster. And in that case, with those lenses, if you put an extension tube on them, you can get much more dreamy macro photos. And for the Nikon Z system, I just happen to own one of those lenses. I own the Nikon Z 50mm f1.4. I was never really a big fan of it, but I actually like it better for macro photography than I do for what it's probably intended for, like portraits or just general scenes, like some street and maybe wider landscapes. So I went out the other day with this lens, the 50mm f1.4, together with extension tubes. And for the majority of the time, I had 32mm of extension tubes on that lens. And with those extension tubes, the lens actually has a maximum magnification of about 0.8. So let's look at some of the photos. I got 4 photos to show you. Let's look at this picture of a dandelion. Now, this dandelion shot is a very minimalist shot. Shallow depth of field, shows just a little bit of the dandelion, and I really love the overall minimalism and the softness to this photo. This photo was taken at f1.8, so you're just not going to get that shallow depth of field look if you used an f2.8 lens. It's extra soft, and I like that extra softness where you can just see the detail of some of those seed umbrellas. This is the kind of shot I'm going for when I'm using extension tubes. I want to take advantage of the characteristics of different lenses, either their faster aperture or their other optical characteristics, to get shots you just can't get with a real macro lens. Let's take a look at another shot. This is another dandelion. I actually took this dandelion shot at f1.4, so the maximum aperture of the lens. So when I say f1.4, by the way, I'm actually referring to the set aperture as being wide open, not the effective aperture, because in macro photography, once you get it to a certain distance, you have to use the effective aperture to calculate things like exposure. But I'm not talking about effective aperture. I'm just talking about the actual set aperture of the lens. Because this lens is not a macro lens, it's not actually informing me of the effective aperture. And since I don't exactly know how close I was here, I can't tell you the exact effective aperture, but the lens was shot wide open. So you get this very dreamy look, and you can see that there's a very nice softness around the seeds. And in general, there's a very soft look at the background. The reason why it's greenish brown in the bottom is because there's some land in the distance, and the transition from the brown to the blue sky would have been harsher if I had used an f2.8 lens. So this is another case where I think the extension tube performed better than a real macro lens, just because I really wanted this shallow depth of field look. This shot was also taken again with the extension tube set attached to that Nikon 50mm f1.4. This was taken at f2.2. So in this shot, you're not really getting that extreme shallow depth of field that you would get if you were shooting wide open. It's still a little bit softer, a little bit more blurred than f2.8, not by a lot, but also one of the things that these adapted lenses, these regular lenses with extension tubes have, is that they're often softer and more dreamy on the edges. The bokeh looks a little bit more swirly, and you get a little bit more of a dreamy look. And I kind of like the look here. You wouldn't get such a soft, dreamy look with a normal macro lens. It looks very interesting. You got some nice color combinations that really blend in. You do get a little bit of that shallower depth of field because it is f2.2 versus f2.8. And that combined with the softer look on the edges kind of creates a more dreamy look. So I'm going to tell you a story. I saw this plant about 2 months ago, I think. And I've always wanted since then to take a shot that really gives the character of this plant. But I've never been able to. I've taken lots of shots with longer lenses. I've tried to use my birding lens. I used a regular 50mm lens without extension tubes. I used my dedicated macro lens. And none of the shots really worked. I was never happy with any of them. I couldn't find a good perspective or a good angle to really get the shot. And with these extension tubes, this was the first time I was able to get a shot that I liked of this plant. So it really does show you that sometimes you have to choose the right tool for the right job to get the kind of look that you want. I got one other final bonus shot for you today. Now this shot was not taken with the Nikon 50mm f1.4Z. I actually used the Viltrox 50mm f2 lens. And this lens is cool because it actually flares in a certain interesting way. I like the flare in some shots, and probably a lens like the Nikon 105mm macro lens, the Z-mount version, is better guarded against flare. So I actually wanted the flare in this shot. So you've got a lot of flare coming out the top, almost looking like the flares emanating from the top of the thistle flower. This is another subject, this flower is another subject that I also really wanted to get a good shot of for a long time. And I've taken quite a few shots of this thistle flower, and I've never liked any of them because they were either too clinical or too realistic, and they just didn't strike me as showing off the nature of this flower. But it wasn't until I took this lens out, again the Viltrox with its flaring ability, with the extension tubes, that I could get a shot of this flower that I liked. So what can we say about the overall discussion? I think that extension tubes are a really cool tool for macro photography. And I actually like extension tubes as much as I like dedicated macro lenses. And that's because you can experiment with different focal lengths and different optical characteristics of the lens to get unique looks that may not be possible with a traditional macro lens. Now, I love my traditional macro lens, and if, say, I wanted to take a very sharp shot of an insect or a fly, then I think I would definitely go for my dedicated macro lens first. But when I want a more dreamy look, or a more unusual look with a little bit of optical imperfections, a little bit of character, I feel like the extension tube, combined with one of the lenses that I talked about, or maybe a different lens even, would be a better tool often than a dedicated macro lens, just because extension tubes produce such interesting results. So I hope you enjoyed this video on extension tubes, and I hope it kind of gives you an idea that extension tubes are more than just a cheap way to do macro photography. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.